Well, good afternoon and welcome to the New Haven Museum's lunchtime webinar. Today, we are so happy to have recently graduated Yale University history student Daphne Stratton Gignac to present Immigrant Artisans and the Building of Yale. Um, Daphne discovered the stories of these people when she heard a local community member's story of her grandfather who had come from Italy to work on Yale's residential colleges. She says she was immediately intrigued, but as she started to research the topic, was struck by the lack of information in Yale's histories surrounding the identities of the craftsmen that contributed to the school's early 20th century buildings. She notes that the lack of recognition seemed unusual considering the level of craftsmanship she saw in the statues and details across the campus. The only mention she could find of these craftsmen was in the late Anthony Riccio's book, Italian American Experience in New Haven, which helped see there was a story here that had been buried, she says. Daphne graduated from Yale University with a bachelor's in history in this past May of 2025. Throughout her time at Yale, her work has centered around exploring cultural pluralism in North America and the history of art and architecture. She was the 2023 recipient of the Ray LaMontagne Essay Prize and a speaker at the Franco-North American Studies Symposium held at Yale in 2025. She plans to pursue a doctorate in history. Welcome, Daphne.
Yay, thank you so much for that introduction, Cynthia. I'm super excited to be here today. So I've titled this presentation, The Untold Tales of Yale's Immigrant Artisans. Untold is kind of in reference to the written record. There's nothing in the written histories of Yale or New Haven seemingly that kind of discusses these Italian and other immigrant artisans who worked on Yale's buildings. But of course, there remains strong community memory. And so the purpose of this project was kind of to unite community stories and community memory of these wonderfully talented craftsmen with the written record and kind of record some of the family stories surrounding their work. So I just wanted to start. Let me see if the presentation, okay, everything's settled here. I'm settling into the Zoom webinar. I haven't used this before. But I just wanted to start off by giving a huge thank you for the New Haven Museum. This is such a wonderful opportunity and everyone has been so helpful. And I just wanted to thank everyone for their involvement with this and helping this happen. I also wanted to thank my lovely advisor, of course, at Yale, Jake Gitlin, for all of his support, enthusiasm throughout this project. I wanted to thank Frank Carano, who made this possible today and has been a huge support. And I also, Cynthia brought it up briefly in the introduction of this project, but I just wanted to shout out Anthony Riccio's work. His book, The Italian American Experience in New Haven, is just such a devoted and loving recounting of New Haven's kind of oral history within Italian American communities. It's just, I wanted to bring attention to his memory as a historian and just all of his wonderful work. It was such an inspiration throughout this project. So check this book out if you haven't already. So moving on, I just wanted to start this looking at the timeline of kind of the time frame that I'm working in here and where we've kind of landed. So we're kind of vaguely in the interwar years, starting at the tail end of World War I and going all the way through 1935, give or take. And so this is just a massive period, a dramatic period of construction at Yale. We have, sorry, one moment, having a problem with my technology. Here we go. So it's just like this proliferation. It was said that the president during this time, James Rowland Angell, came to a college in Brownstone and left it a college in Granite. It just a complete overhaul of the campus, essentially. And at the same time, we're coinciding with this period of great turmoil and kind of identity seeking within the greater United States. Of course, we have the tail end of World War I, a conflict that brings to mind a lot of questions about humanity and about society. And then just a very tumultuous period in terms of immigrant relations in the United States. So, of course, the horrible Sacco and Vanzetti trials, where two Italian men, innocent men, are executed, and kind of landmark legislation like the Emergency Quota Act and the Johnson-Reed Act, which severely make set quotas for immigration based on the amount of immigrants already in the U.S. Then, of course, this is all bookended by the Great Depression. So it's just a period of great kind of upheaval in the US. And that really factors in. This is really an important context to consider when telling this story. So I launched into this project, as Cynthia was saying, based on the story of a community member, thinking, oh, like this will be easy enough to investigate. I'll just kind of go to the archives. I'll find some little nice corner of the special collections. I'll find all the names of the people who worked there. But I had the complete opposite experience. I went to the archives and I found nothing. I was rifling through personnel files, kind of the expenditures, looking at all the papers relating to the projects for all the buildings. It's not to say that's nowhere in there. I am an amateur historian, of course, and I think there's some further investigation required. But what I did find was a lot of nameless faces, not a lot of conclusions to be had. So I was deeply intrigued. And as I started to research, the questions that I asked transitioned from who were these artisans to how did they get forgotten? How in such a dramatic project, how do we have very little, we only have really 3 craftsmen recorded, and they're the kind of celebrity craftsmen who were in charge of kind of much of the design work. But a lot of this highly sophisticated stone cutting and woodwork, stained glass work, it's just unrecorded who partook in that. So, yeah, sorry, one moment. Here we are. And so to kind of get an understanding of this, of course, I couldn't research the topic directly, so I decided, let me start researching around. Let me start getting the context of this story and start to get an understanding of what relations were like in New Haven at the time. So it was a particularly tumultuous time in the relationships of Yale and New Haven. That became clear quickly into my research. The tail end of the 19th century into the early 20th century, you had fights breaking out in the streets and in bars between Yale students and New Haveners. You had Yale building an additional set of buildings to block the green off from the college campus. And you had Yale removing the Connecticut representatives from their board of trustees. So there's this sense that there's a wedge driving in between Yale and New Haven. And this is largely related to the fact that their populations are just becoming very different. During this time, leading into World War I, you start to have Yale students becoming increasingly the most privileged sons of America, if you will. They're coming from industrial barons, and they're coming to Yale and forming a space of kind of privilege, and kind of relative kind of religious homogeneity. It's a very kind of different group from New Haven, which has developed into this kind of thriving hub of industry. And the 1910 US Census found that 70% of New Haveners were either immigrants or the children of immigrants. So it's very different. Yale students and New Haveners start to become different religiously, socioeconomically, and ethnically. So this kind of starts to fuel fire of tension between Yale and its hometown. So kind of amidst this time of tension, you have Yale is deciding that it wants to create a campus befitting of this place of status that it's gradually becoming. So they enlist the help of the architect James Gamble Rogers to design first a building known as the Memorial Quadrangle, which is today become Saybrook and Brantford Colleges. This dramatic building with the large Harkness Tower that kind of looms over all around it. Um, and so James Gamble Rogers buildings in this collegiate Gothic style, which we'll discuss further in this presentation, um, that starts to become the vision for Yale. And, to fund these projects, you have just industrial wealth just spurting from all places of the country. Of course, notably the Sterling Bequest, which was the largest single donation to a university at that time in history. So I think it amounted to nearly $30 million by the end of, or by 1930. So just this kind of unimaginable sum of money that stretches even further during the Great Depression, just to kind of take any of Yale's plans and bring them to fruition. You also have the Harkness donations, which also amount to just this kind of unimaginable sum over the course of that family's time donating to Yale. So, goodness. So what the university starts to imagine is not only a project that will redefine the physical footprint of New Haven and kind of change the entire aesthetics of Yale itself, but a project that really creates a founding myth for the college. So you have this collegiate Gothic style, which does so many different things. For one, it doesn't look like anything in New Haven. There are a couple, I imagine, neo-Gothic kind of churches, but this really separates it. Again, town of brick and then school of granite. It's like a firm line. Then also it's kind of clearly associates the university with an Anglo-Saxon culture, with Oxford and Cambridge. And so that, for one, is a statement in the face of a lot mass Eastern European and Southern European immigration. Of course, to kind of associate Yale with an Anglo-Saxon background is a statement in itself of kind of the nativist and anti-immigrant attitudes that were prevalent among the administration of the time. And then, just in case that wasn't enough, they build high walls and surround everything with moats. So that's a pretty clear commentary on the kind of affiliation they want to have with New Haven. It's an attempt to distinguish Yale from New Haven. And this kind of, in all, I mean, as we see today, the campus feels like very intentionally, based on the architect's plans, like it's from another time, like it's from a time before industry, where, craftsmanship triumphs over kind of assembly line labor. And in this way, it creates this powerful myth for Yale that Yale is some kind of haughty, pre-industrial kind of place of education versus New Haven, which is this kind of totally separate factory city. So again, just kind of separating Yale and New Haven, not only physically or kind of aesthetically, but kind of philosophically and intellectually. Like, we come from a different time and from a different kind of view on the world, essentially, is what this style was trying to convey. And what you end up having, because of this commitment to this kind of opposing this factory-made appearance, as James Gamble Rogers said was his goal in these designs, is you have just this triumph of ornamental and decorative architecture. I mean, just in Sterling Library alone, you have over 600 decorative sculptures, 3,300 panes of stained glass, and that's not to mention ceiling paintings, woodwork, ironwork. It's just kind of this unbelievable achievement, particularly for its time in the decorative arts. And yet at the same time, as someone like me trying to find who completed these projects, for a set of structures so committed to its decoration and sculpture, it kind of makes it all the more strange that we don't remember any of the craftsmen. This was a very intentionally ornamental project, and yet the very people who brought this to life go unremembered. So throughout this whole project, I was being taunted by this article by a British historian, EAG, from 1952, who just waltzed into the Oxford records and was like, oh, here's a record from the 1300s of which Mason worked on which project. He literally was able to find records of exactly who, like with names and everything, of who worked on each college within Oxford in 1370. And I was like, this was 100 years ago, and I can't find anything on Yale. And so the more I researched, the more I thought, we have immigrant tensions kind of spiraling out of control across the country. If this community member's story holds true for many of the craftsmen involved, I'm starting to see how Yale maybe wasn't eager to keep the records of the craftsmen who worked on their projects. That this, yes, while of course a lot of the personnel files are included with the contractors, so kind of we don't have access to them anymore, unfortunately. It doesn't seem like any particular effort was made to keep track of the names of particular sculptors or any other sort of craftsman who was affiliated with specific works. So luckily, we had one artisan that we did know from this project is master blacksmith Samuel Yellen, who was a Ukrainian Jewish immigrant from Philadelphia. And he had a lot of opinions on the world of artisanry and kind of the decorative arts in America, very conveniently, very expressive in interviews about his experiences. So he actually offers some very real insight into this project. Of course, he's involved. This here, pictured here, is the memorial gate, originally attached to the memorial quadrangle, and it's now attached to one of the colleges, right underneath Harkness Tower. He also was extensively involved inside of Sterling Library in the law school, I believe. He has a couple other works. So he was doing work. He was working quite a bit on this project. And this is, of course, just a stunning piece of art. I mean, these flowers are just so delicate. He truly was a master. And so we have his commentaries on his kind of staff, and he gives us a sense of kind of the personnel involved with these projects. So he very expressionally says, there are no American boys in my shop, and you don't even hear English. And seems to suggest that that was very common across the crafts in America at the time. Essentially, you just had not only no interest in training craftsmen, but kind of none of the educational infrastructure. So he basically claims that all of the skilled men that were coming in to work on a project kind of like this would have been coming over, having gotten their training in Europe and coming over here. So that kind of led me back to a lot of the stories, or a couple of the stories that I'd been able to pull from different sources throughout this kind of research journey I'd been having. So one of the stories I was able to find was in that lovely Italian-American experience in New Haven by Riccio. And it was a story told by a community member, Salvatore Garibaldi, where he stated the faces on outside of Sterling Memorial, or pardon me, Sterling Law Building actually represent the faces modeled after this kind of tradition of putting faces on the exteriors of buildings back in small towns in Italy. And so he kind of draws this direct cultural link with some of these details that we see on these buildings with kind of the backgrounds and the trainings of these artisans. Similarly, I actually was able to talk to James Gamble Rogers' grandson, and he was telling me his grandfather always told him that these faces were modeled after the actual faces of the craftsmen who worked on them. So whether they're modeled actually after their faces or just after kind of their traditions, we get a sense that Yale's campus is probably very much influenced by kind of the cultural backgrounds and kind of the trainings of these craftsmen, and that we're actually seriously kind of missing out on a lot of kind of the deeper symbolisms of these details that for those of us who spend time at Yale are seeing every day. And so of course that led me, well, the goal of the project the whole time was to find people and tell their stories. And luckily I was able to find a couple of individuals affiliated with these Yale's projects in various forms. But it just drove home the importance to me of finding out there's these craftsmen stories, these artisan stories, and telling them, and kind of really getting a deeper appreciation for the kind of campus as we know and love it today, and just really just to give credit to the kind of wonderful artistic vision and kind of long-standing these craftsmen were carrying on long-standing traditions from their home and bringing them to New Haven. And there's so much beauty in that if we can bring those kind of stories to light. So the two folks that I was able to find who were contributed to Yale's projects were Peter S. Saldivar and Francisco Coiro. These two men came from different places in Italy. Francisco Coiro came from Cesarunca, Italy, when he was 19 years old, leaving behind his family in the early 20th century. Peter Saldivar came over at just the age of 3 years old. His father was actually recruited to work on Grand Central Station as a terrazzo mechanic, so doing kind of like fine marble work. It's combining like chips of marble and concrete and to make like flooring patterns, essentially, from what I understand. And he was actually approached by a recruiter coming from the States saying, we want you to assemble a team to install the flooring and I believe there was some wall detailing in this Grand Central Station. It'll take a number of years, this project. And so he left with $20 in his pocket and came to the United States. So we get the sense, even just kind of a brief bio of these two men. These men were both highly educated. Peter Saldivar actually attended Yale to do a Bachelor of Fine Arts, along with some master's students from between 1929 and 1931. Francisco Coiro was actually educated back in Italy, and as a decorative artist, and came over to contribute. He painted many of the churches in New Haven. He worked on the ceilings of Sterling Memorial Library, surely among other projects. But as I'll delve further into their stories in the next few slides. But these two men were highly educated, bringing with them really traditions of art. They were carrying on, both inspired by their family to kind of pursue the arts. And we get a sense that their work was really imbued with that kind of not only their love of art, their kind of cultural and familial love of art. And that's really tangible in their work. So first, just gonna discuss Peter Saldivar here. We're very lucky to have a number of images provided by his lovely daughter, Pat Martini, who I grew close to over the course of this project. So Peter has actually a really interesting story. Of course, as I mentioned, he came over following his father, who was recruited for this Grand Central Station project. He left school before high school to start an apprenticeship at a stone cutters and memorial makers shop in West Haven. So he was excelled so much in this in these stone cutting tasks that actually the owner of the shop, Giordano, sent him to Yale and said, you have to pursue sculpture and pursue a degree in this. And he was able to obtain scholarships for his years of study, and actually went on to win the prestigious Prix de Rome in 1931. And with that, studied in France. He had the chance to work with a number of very talented sculptors and very well-known sculptors in America. He worked with John Angel, who was a very prominent sculptor in the early 20th century. He was able to work on the project of Prometheus, the lovely golden statue that decorates Rockefeller Center. As you can see here in this photo on the right, you can see he was actually responsible for carving the hand of this statue. So he had a very kind of prolific career. This in the middle is one of his original works in a cemetery in Pennsylvania. Um, he was very talented, as you know, kind of demonstrated by his credentials, his attendance of Yale, his numerous kind of accolades that he received over his career. And yet we see that his name has gone unrecorded. The projects that he worked on with various sculptors, talented sculptors across the US, he was not given credit for because at the time, the designer was the only party given credit. So as with this statue here on the right, this is a statue that stands today at West Point. It's a statue of General Patton. The sculptor that was the designer of this, though the sculptor did not actually do the stone cutting or bring this sculpture to life in its final bronze form, is the only one given credit for it. So we don't see Saldivar's name listed anywhere relating to this statue in any kind of record. So suddenly you start to see this pattern of, well, naturally, if even a sculptor as talented as Saldivar, who is receiving all of these accolades from different institutions, who attends Yale, he is not receiving the credit that he deserves, and his name is not being preserved in memory for many of the projects that he's worked on. So we can start to see how a pattern would form here, not only across for individuals like Saldivar, but across an entire profession, an entire artist class that likely existed in New Haven, made up of Italian craftsmen, likely with some like Yellen, some perhaps Eastern European craftsmen, and how their work would just be kind of outshined by the work of more prominent sculptors. And they didn't necessarily have the chance to kind of gain that celebrity or to kind of move up in the art world. Francisco Coiro kind of has a similar story. He was a decorative painter. Both of these men kind of struggled. It was a very difficult thing to kind of earn your bread in the art world as an Italian craftsman at this time, even despite the fact that everyone recognized they were the most talented in the world because they had these wonderfully esteemed traditions going back centuries, and kind of where the US lacked all of the kind of institutional or educational infrastructure to teach craftsmen, Italy has kind of had these institutions for centuries. So Francisco Coiro was trained at this very prestigious art school in Caserta, near his home. And yet when he came here, he couldn't find much kind of substantial employment. It was a lot of stencil work. And yet we see that in his work at Yale, part of the reason that we know his name, or I was able to find it at least, is that his signature was found on the ceiling of Sterling Library, along with his address and along with names of his fellow artisans working alongside of him. So we have this sense of a deep pride in their work. Both Saldivar and Coiro, both of their families speak of kind of their dedication to their arts, of their insistence on kind of pursuing their art and bringing this craft to America. And yet we see that this effort was it was a difficult battle. It was an uphill battle that was faced with a lot of financial difficulty as well. So Coiro is kind of another example of one of those individuals who he's done much work, of course, in the various churches in New Haven, and at Yale. And yet he's just one of these folks that was just kind of not preserved in the record. His existence as an individual and as a part of this class, like I previously said, this artist class is just kind of, it doesn't exist. It's not represented in the historical record. Despite kind of in both these men's cases, their extensive contributions to the built environment that we enjoy every day in New Haven and even beyond. In the case of Saldivar, with his projects in New York and beyond. So I suppose the kind of concluding remarks of this presentation before we get into the question section, is just kind of analyzing, trying to see deeper social justice in the way that we tell the stories of our built environment, and trying to really my goal in this research project was just to provide the credit to these men and a place for these men in history who have contributed so much. And as I worked on this, I felt just how much I was only scratching the surface. I found similar stories in different parts of the country. I constantly have people telling me about their relative who worked on so and so project in their town, and how they were never given credit. So really, I see this project as kind of a bigger effort as well to kind of re-examine the way that we tell kind of art history within the country, and kind of being vigilant for the ways that anti-immigrant sentiment may be kind of seeped into the historical record and has led to erasure of many of America's most talented artists. So I guess with that, we can go into the question portion. Thank you all so much for listening.
Daphne, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. And I think many of us will sort of walk around New Haven now, looking at some of this, in a different way. So I'm going to kind of go through the questions. First one I see on the slide, Sterling Memorial Library, Boys, 1930. Any chance the names of the men in the pictures are known? In particular, the pic in the upper left quadrant.
I really wish they were. I couldn't find any names associated with them. I thought they were just wonderful photos. I love the picture in the bottom left-hand corner where you see them like all laughing and looking around. I really wish we knew. I couldn't find them anywhere. Maybe it's deep. There's so many boxes of stuff. So maybe it's deep in there somewhere, but there was nothing on the back of the thing. There was nothing included in the kind of in the box that I looked in. So yeah, I don't think so.
Okay. Is the granite source identified?
Yes. From what I understand, much of it was Weymouth granite from Weymouth, Mass. I think that's where the vast majority of it came from, at least for, yeah, those kind of dozen core buildings. So we have the 8 residential colleges, the Sterling Memorial Library, Sterling Law Building, the William Harkness Hall, and yeah, that would be it. I believe it's all Weymouth granite.
Okay. And you may have answered this. Where did Sal de Bar come from?
Oh, I didn't mention that.
Okay.
Saldivar came from Udine, Italy, so right in the northeast corner.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you know who dictated the themes of the sculptures?
Yeah. I believe it was a collaboration. So we had there's a lot of cool fun facts I wasn't able to include just for the sake of time, but of course there's Rene P. Chambellan, who is the head sculptor. Then it seems like there was an initial kind of brainstorming phase with the architects. Rene P. Chambellan, the sculptor, sculpted many of the designs. Not sure how many. I get the sense that there was probably some that the craftsmen were also kind of designing themselves. Then it was signed off by the architect. Then it went to a clay modeling stage. Then it went to stone cutters to execute. I think that's the general sense. There are really interesting like for Sterling Library, there's a really interesting, I guess, booklet that has all of the different art, like decorative things. It's like a brochure of all the decorative things and like what their symbolisms are and like what languages they include and what the inscriptions say. So that's really cool to look through. But yeah, I really wish we knew more about individual sculptures, because every time I talk about this, someone's like, what is that? Like unicorn symbolize over there? And I wish I knew, but yeah, I haven't quite. Yeah, that's more research necessary for that.
Right. Have to dig a little bit deeper.
Yeah, so much to do with
Um,
that.
I'm actually going to answer this question. The presentation has been recorded, and it will be up on our YouTube channel, in a few days. So
Great.
that answers a question. Um, Another one, did they do any work in Trinity Church or Grove Street Cemetery?
That is a great question. I would imagine yes. I haven't researched those in particular. It seems like in terms of memorials, like the Italian population really had that market kind of on lock. They were kind of the primary ones making all different kinds of memorials. So I would assume yes for Grove Street. Trinity Church, again, the decorative arts were really seemingly kind of dominated by Italians. So I would imagine yes. And I'm sure there's some overlap with people working on the two structures at the same time as Yale.
And this is a good question. How much freedom did the artisans have in their depictions?
I really wish I knew. Again, that kind of information, that same, when I was talking about the faces on the wall, Salvatore Garibaldi was saying that the Italians were kind of they were so prideful in their work that they kind of would just go off script and they were like, no, but this looks better. So apparently, the architect, and I heard the same thing from the architect's grandson, was kind of like, okay, you guys do what you want to do. Like, you seem to know what you want to see. And I mean, they were incredibly talented, just like wonderful artistic vision, not only I'm seemingly wanting to execute the plans of others. So I think by the sounds of it, they brought like so much kind of gusto to the project that they were like, well, this is how I want to, this is good, how it's going to look best. Um, and they were kind of competing with each other. I heard again from Garibaldi's interview in that book. So I think probably it's hard to say. I mean, it's one of those things that's like really difficult, and I wish I could understand all the dynamics that were going on between different contractors and different entities on these projects. But I think some degree of freedom for sure.
Okay. I was told there was a tent city for Italian craftsmen out at the Yale Bowl. Have you seen any records of this?
No, that sounds fascinating though. I was so excited to do this project because I was like, I know the audience members are going to know way more. Like there's going to be stories coming out from everywhere. So that's really cool. And I will definitely look into that. That's fascinating. Yeah, I didn't find anything about that, but I'd love to look into that more.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple more and then just Daphne, would you mind if there are more questions, putting your email
Yeah.
in the chat? That way,
Mhm.
if people have questions.
Yeah, right now.
But this one, she has a question about the sculptures on the law school in particular. I've
Yeah.
always been fascinated with how edgy they are. The one of the faculty member haranguing the students who are sleeping, the cops who
Yeah.
look mean, the guns, not standard law school iconography or
Yeah.
Gothic. Do you know who made the decisions about exactly what these would look like and why they look the way they do?
Yeah, I believe Renee P. Chambellan was still the head sculptor for these projects. I really wish I knew who was responsible for these decisions. Like you don't even know how much I wish I knew. Um, I think I've definitely heard some like in some of Yale's histories, they talk about how there was a really interesting shift from places like the Memorial Quadrangle, which was very kind of Yale centered and very donor centric, kind of historically, it kind of, I guess aloof isn't the right word, but it's very kind of grandiose and historical and trying to make something out of Yale. But I think the law school has like a really interesting shift where it goes to kind of that more, like you said, edgy, kind of tongue-in-cheek, playful, kind of there's more of a sense of interaction with kind of what the purpose of that building is and like the outside world. I believe probably I hear that James Gamble Rogers from his grandson, it was actually had like a great sense of humor and loved to like integrate jokes into his designs. So I bet there was kind of like collaboration between James Gamble Rogers, the head designer, and the craftsmen who were executing the designs. Yeah.
Um, so this presentation, I'm going to answer this question. This presentation is being presented by the New Haven Museum. My name is Cynthia Riccio, and I'm the Director of Programs and Planning here at the museum. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And one final question, do you think it may be possible for Yale to acknowledge these artisans?
Oh, that is what I want so very badly. I think in my imagination of how this would go, there would be some kind of plaque or some kind of recognition of, these wonderfully talented, largely unrecognized folks who have been done kind of this disservice by the historical record. So I would love to work to have some kind of recognition made by Yale. So yeah, I think that's a great goal. I hope it can be achieved.
Well, I just want to thank you again, Daphne, for presenting today. I want to thank everybody who joined us today. This is actually the first in a series of webinars that we are going to do this summer featuring student work. So keep an eye out for one coming in July and one coming in August. And again, thank you all. Thank you, Daphne. We look forward to more information, possibly a book in the future, maybe.
Yeah, I hope I can, yeah, I hope I can take that project on. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really have enjoyed presenting today. And thank you so much to everyone who came. Um, yeah, please reach
Great.
out if you have any info, if you have any stories to share. I would love to hear them.
And look for the recording on our YouTube channel in a few days. I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you.